The morning air clung heavy and damp as we drove up the winding road to Black Hollow Woods. A pale sun hung low in the sky, veiled by clouds that seemed reluctant to let even a sliver of warmth seep through. I glanced out the car window, watching the skeletal branches twist and claw at the horizon. There was a sinister elegance to the woods, an aura of foreboding that couldn't be ignored, even by the most rational mind. "You're quiet today," Elliot remarked, keeping his eyes firmly on the road ahead. His voice was steady, unhurried, but it was enough to pull me from my thoughts. I turned to him, noting how his angular face remained as composed as ever. The man was a fortress of calm, even in the face of mysteries that sent others sprinting in the opposite direction. "Just trying to soak it all in," I replied. "These woods have a way of making you feel unwelcome." Elliot didn't respond immediately, his brow furrowing as he adjusted his grip on the wheel. "Unwelcome or watched," he finally said, and his words hung in the air like a whisper meant for someone else. We were heading to the site where the Wilson family's car had been discovered days earlier. Mr. Wilson, his wife, and their 9-year-old daughter had vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Their vehicle was found abandoned at the edge of the woods, keys still in the ignition, and the doors ajar, as if they had fled in a hurry. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing but the eerie emptiness of the forest to greet the search party. Elliot parked the car at the edge of a small clearing where the Wilsons' vehicle sat waiting, an unassuming shell of something far more ominous. A sheriff's deputy, lean and grizzled, stood nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as though the earth itself might betray him. "Detective Brooks," he greeted stiffly. His gaze flickered to me for a brief moment before dismissing me as the less important counterpart. It wasn't the first time I'd been overshadowed in Elliot's presence, nor would it be the last. "Deputy Harris," Elliot returned with a curt nod, stepping out of the car and heading straight for the abandoned vehicle. I followed close behind, notebook in hand, trying to shake the unease that gripped me. "Been out here long?" I asked Harris, hoping to extract even a small detail that might help us piece together what had happened. "Long enough," he muttered, his jaw tight. "Don't like it out here, though. Feels wrong, like the woods don't want us poking around." I frowned, glancing at the tree line. There was something unnervingly still about the trees, their branches frozen mid-motion as if holding their breath. "Anything unusual about the car? Besides the fact that it's the only damn thing here?" "Not much. No prints, no blood, nothing." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "Found this on the back seat, though." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, charred doll. Its button eyes stared back at me, lifeless yet strangely accusing. A chill ran down my spine, and I exchanged a look with Elliot, who had been inspecting the car doors. "Was this here when the ranger found the vehicle?" Elliot asked, his tone sharp. Harris shook his head. "Not that he mentioned." "Then someone's been here since." Elliot's words hit like a hammer, and I scribbled furiously in my notebook, documenting every detail: the doll, the absence of footprints, the unsettling atmosphere. Everything about this case felt wrong, but it wasn't the kind of wrong that could be fixed with logic or reason. It was a deeper, darker kind of wrong, one that whispered of forces beyond our understanding. As Elliot circled the car, his movements precise and deliberate, I couldn't help but marvel at his composure. He had a way of seeing what others missed, of peeling back the layers of reality to expose the raw, pulsing truths beneath. It was both a gift and a burden, and I often wondered how he carried it without breaking. "We'll need to check the woods," Elliot announced, his voice cutting through the fog of my thoughts. Harris stiffened, his expression one of reluctant disbelief. "You're joking, right? These woods go on for miles, and with the fog, we'd be lucky to make it back in one piece. Luck has little to do with it, Elliot replied, already heading toward the tree line. Every moment we hesitate could mean the difference between finding them alive or not. I exchanged a glance with Harris, who seemed ready to protest, but ultimately he grabbed a flashlight and followed. I did the same, clutching my notebook like a lifeline as we ventured into the depths of Black Hollow Woods. The air grew colder with every step, the trees closing in around us like the walls of an ancient cathedral. There was a weight to the silence, a palpable tension that seemed to press down on my chest. Even the occasional rustle of leaves sounded like a warning. "You see anything?" I whispered, keeping close to Elliot. "Not yet," he murmured, his eyes scanning the shadows with the intensity of a predator. "Stay alert. These woods have a way of hiding what they don't want you to find." It wasn't an encouraging thought, but I nodded all the same. As we moved deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Elliot stopped suddenly, raising a hand for silence. I strained my ears, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just the suffocating stillness of the woods. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was a piece of torn fabric, a child's jacket, stained with mud and something darker. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "The daughters?" "Possibly," Elliot murmured. "But there's something else." He crouched and brushed away the leaves, revealing a series of markings carved into the earth. They formed a strange, spiraling pattern, intricate and deliberate, as though etched by a hand guided by something otherworldly. "Any idea what this means?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. "Not yet," Elliot replied, his expression unreadable. "But it's not random." Before I could press him further, a low, guttural sound echoed through the woods. It wasn't the howl of an animal or the rustle of wind, it was something far more primal, a noise that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. Harris froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "What the hell was that?" Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he switched off his flashlight, plunging us into near darkness. "Stay quiet," he ordered, his voice barely audible. The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt my pulse spike. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I held my ground, my legs rooted by fear and curiosity. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise ceased. The woods fell silent once more, but the oppressive atmosphere remained, heavier than ever. Elliot turned to us, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Let's keep moving." We followed him deeper into the forest, the shadows closing in around us like hungry jaws. I couldn't help but wonder if we were chasing answers, or walking straight into the heart of something far darker than we'd imagined. The silence in Black Hollow Woods was a kind that seeped into your very bones, amplifying every rustle, every breath, until the simplest sound felt monumental. I had always thought of myself as a man of reason, a history teacher with a penchant for myths and folklore, yes, but still grounded in the tangible world. Yet, as we continued deeper into the forest, I couldn't ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were fixed on us. Elliot moved with his usual purposefulness, his steps measured and deliberate, flashlight cutting clean beams through the mist. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but there was a tautness to his shoulders that I recognized. It was the kind of tension he carried when the situation called for more than just logic and deduction. "Do you feel that?" I asked quietly, my voice sounding unnaturally loud against the muted backdrop of the woods. "Feel what?" Elliot replied, though I noticed he didn't stop scanning the trees as he spoke. Like we're being watched. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. The woods play tricks, Miguel. Stay focused. Easier said than done, I thought to myself as I adjusted my grip on the flashlight. The ground beneath us was uneven, covered in a thick carpet of leaves and roots that seemed intent on tripping us at every step. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the air became, as though the forest itself was closing in around us. What do you make of those markings? I asked, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. The ones we found near the fabric. Elliot's jaw tightened. They're deliberate. Not random scratches or animal tracks. Someone, or something, wanted them to be found. And the spiral pattern? Does it mean anything? He hesitated before answering. Spirals are often associated with cycles, birth, death, and rebirth. They can signify eternity or the passage of time. But here, they feel more like a warning. I stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. A warning of what? Before he could respond, a sudden rustling sound to our left snapped both our attention to the underbrush. I froze, my pulse quickening as I swung my flashlight toward the source of the noise. The beam caught on tangled branches, swaying slightly as though something had just moved through them. Probably an animal, Elliot said, though his hand hovered near the holster at his hip. I wasn't convinced. There had been something unnerving about the sound, too deliberate, too heavy to belong to a simple deer or raccoon. But I swallowed my doubt and pressed on, not wanting to appear weak in front of Elliot or the increasingly jittery Deputy Harris, who was lagging a few steps behind us. This is insane, Harris muttered, his voice tight with unease. We shouldn't be out here. People disappear in these woods. Good people. Then perhaps you prefer to wait by the car, Elliot said without breaking stride. The rest of us will carry on. Harris didn't answer, but I could hear him muttering under his breath, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he tried to keep up. The forest seemed to thicken around us, the trees growing closer together until their gnarled roots formed a tangled maze that was nearly impossible to navigate. The fog was denser here, clinging to the ground like smoke and muffling our movements. It was as if the woods were deliberately trying to disorient us, to draw us deeper into its grasp. It wasn't long before we came across another strange discovery, a clearing with a massive oak tree standing in its center. The tree's trunk was scarred with deep carvings, symbols that mirrored the spiral pattern we had found earlier. Beneath it lay what appeared to be a small stone altar, weathered and cracked but unmistakably man-made. This is it, Elliot said quietly, stepping closer to the tree. This is what we've been looking for. An altar? I asked, joining him. My voice sounded hollow in the open space, as if the clearing itself was swallowing the sound. What's it doing out here? Elliot ran a gloved hand over the carvings, his expression grim. It's old. Very old. But it's been disturbed recently, see here? He pointed to a patch of earth near the altar, where the soil had been freshly turned. Someone's been digging. What would they be digging for? Harris asked, his earlier bravado now replaced with genuine fear. Something they shouldn't have, Elliot replied. I crouched beside the disturbed soil, using a stick to prod at the loose dirt. A faint metallic glint caught my eye, and I carefully uncovered a rusted fragment of what appeared to be a ceremonial blade. Its edge was jagged and worn, but there was a malevolent energy about it that made my skin crawl. Do you think this was part of some kind of ritual? I asked, handing the blade to Elliot. Undoubtedly, he said, examining it closely. But rituals like this are rarely benign. Whatever was done here, it wasn't meant to bring peace. As he spoke, the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop even further, the air growing so cold that I could see my breath forming in front of me. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Harris whispered, his voice barely audible. Elliot nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the surrounding forest. "We're not alone." The wail came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. It was a sound of anguish, of despair, and it seemed to echo from every direction at once. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my heart pounding as I turned in circles, trying to locate the source. "Stay close," Elliot ordered, drawing his revolver. "Whatever it is, it wants to scare us. Don't let it." Easier said than done, I thought, my palms slick with sweat despite the frigid air. The wailing grew more frantic, accompanied by the rustling of branches and the snapping of twigs. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, closing in around us with each passing moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased. The silence was deafening, the kind that made your ears ring with its absence. I glanced at Elliot, whose expression was as inscrutable as ever, though I could see the tension in his jaw. "We should leave," Harris said, his voice shaking. "Whatever this is, we're in over our heads." "Not yet," Elliot replied. "There's still more to uncover here." I wasn't sure whether to admire his determination or question his sanity, but I knew better than to argue. Instead, I turned my attention back to the altar, my fingers tracing the carvings as I tried to decipher their meaning. There was something familiar about them, something I had come across in my studies, but I couldn't quite place it. "We need to document this," I said, pulling out my notebook. "If these symbols are connected to the curse, they could be the key to understanding what's happening." Elliot nodded, but his attention was elsewhere, his eyes fixed on a faint trail that led deeper into the woods. Without a word, he began to follow it, his movements as precise as ever. Harris hesitated, looking at me for reassurance, but I simply shrugged and followed Elliot. After all, there was no turning back now. The trail wound its way through the forest, leading us to another clearing, this one smaller and more sinister. At its center stood a crude wooden structure, half collapsed and covered in moss. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, though there was a strange freshness to the trampled grass around it. "This place," Elliot began, but before he could finish, the wailing returned, louder, closer, and filled with a rage that made my blood run cold. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us yet. The mournful wails had ceased, but their echoes lingered in my chest like a phantom grip on my lungs. The clearing ahead came into sharp focus, dominated by the skeletal remains of a wooden structure that seemed to lean toward us like a silent sentinel. It was a decrepit thing, half sunken into the earth, its beams fractured and covered in moss and decay, but there was something undeniably deliberate about its placement. It belonged to the woods, and yet it didn't, not entirely. Elliot stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes narrowed as he took in every detail with a scrutiny I could only aspire to. His flashlight cut across the shadowed space, illuminating patches of overgrown grass and fragmented wood, as if each beam sought out secrets that the forest sought to keep hidden. Deputy Harris lingered behind me, his breathing shallow and uneven. He had become an anchor of unease ever since we ventured into Black Hollow Woods, and the scene before us didn't appear to be doing him any favors. "Stay sharp," Elliot murmured without turning back. His voice was low, deliberate, a warning as much as it was a directive. I gripped my own flashlight tighter and stepped forward, feeling the weight of every movement as if the woods themselves were pushing back against our intrusion. "This structure, it's not natural," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "Look at the way it's built." This wasn't some simple shelter. Elliot nodded, his gaze shifting to the ground beneath the building. It's a foundation. Someone made this with purpose. But why leave it to rot? I took a few steps closer, the soft earth squelching beneath my boots. The air here was colder than it should have been, colder than the fog or the surrounding forest, as if this place carried its own breath, a breath that chilled your bones. I've seen drawings of structures like these before, I said, kneeling beside a jagged piece of wood that had splintered away from a larger frame. In research journals about early settlement patterns. Some groups, fringe groups, used them for gatherings, ceremonies. I always assumed they were exaggerations. Exaggerations don't explain this, Elliot replied, his tone as steady as ever. He crouched beside me, his flashlight illuminating what looked like claw marks etched into the wood, deliberate, deep, and impossibly uniform. Harris finally summoned the courage to speak. Ceremonies? What kind of ceremonies? I didn't answer immediately, my fingers brushing across the jagged grooves. They radiated a sense of violence, of desperation. Rituals, I said at last. It's possible some settlers used structures like this to communicate with forces they didn't fully understand. That doesn't exactly ease my mind, Harris muttered. Elliot stood, his flashlight sweeping across the beams again. The Wilson family didn't come across this by accident. Someone brought them here. I felt my stomach tighten at the implication. Do you think the markings have anything to do with the spiral patterns we saw earlier? Elliot didn't reply immediately, but I could see his mind working, piecing together fragments of the puzzle that even I couldn't begin to comprehend. The spiral is a guide, he said finally. It leads here. Whoever, or whatever, marked the trail wanted it to be followed. I swallowed hard, glancing around the clearing. The shadows stretched long and thin, creeping toward us like fingers seeking something to grasp. I had never felt anything like this before, a tangible sense of dread that seemed to saturate the very air around us. We need to document this, I said, pulling out my notebook. My fingers were shaking as I scribbled details about the structure, the claw marks, the oppressive chill that hung over the clearing. Every detail seemed significant, even if I couldn't yet see how they fit together. Elliot moved closer to the center of the structure, his footsteps cautious but deliberate. As he approached what remained of the foundation, his flashlight caught on something metallic. He bent down and retrieved a rusted object from the grass, a small, jagged blade, its edge worn and splintered but unmistakably sharp. "What do you make of this?" he asked, holding the blade up for me to see. I stepped closer, my flashlight casting a pale glow on the object. The blade was crude, almost primitive, but there was a certain intricacy to the handle, which was wrapped in strips of leather that had long since deteriorated. It didn't look like an ordinary tool, it looked ceremonial. "A weapon, maybe," I said, studying the object more closely. "But not for battle. This was meant for something specific. A ritual, perhaps." Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable. Then whatever ritual this was, it wasn't meant to bring peace. Before I could respond, a sudden noise cut through the air, a sharp, snapping sound like wood splintering under pressure. I turned sharply, my flashlight swinging across the clearing, but there was nothing. Just the skeletal beams and the encroaching darkness. "You heard that, didn't you?" Harris whispered, his voice trembling. "Yes," I said, my pulse quickening. "Elliot, what was that?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze locked on the tree line. His posture was tense, his shoulders squared as though preparing for whatever might emerge from the shadows. "Stay close," he said quietly. "And keep your flashlight steady." Harris muttered something incoherent, his flashlight beam shaking as he tried to illuminate the source of the sound. But the woods refused to cooperate. They seemed to absorb the light, bending it into shadows that defied explanation. The snapping noise came again, this time closer, a deliberate sound, almost like footsteps crushing dry branches underfoot. My throat tightened as I swung my beam toward the sound, but still there was nothing. The clearing remained empty, yet the air felt charged, electric. "Is it watching us?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Elliot didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He gripped the rusted blade tightly, his flashlight fixed on the tree lean. And then, without warning, the sound ceased. The clearing fell silent, as though the forest itself had paused to catch its breath. "What do we do now?" Harris asked, his voice brittle. "We keep moving," Elliot said firmly. "Whatever this is, it wants us scared. Don't give it the satisfaction." I wasn't sure whether to admire his resolve or question his sanity, but I knew better than to argue. I followed him as he began to circle the structure, his movements slow and calculated, his eyes scanning every detail. As we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that the clearing was alive, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that defied understanding. It seemed to pulse, to breathe, and every step felt like trespassing on something ancient and sacred. Elliot stopped abruptly, his flashlight beam fixed on a patch of ground near the edge of the clearing. There, half buried in the earth, was another object, a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and damp but intact enough to hold its secrets. "Looks like someone left us a message," he said, retrieving the journal and flipping it open. The pages were worn and yellowed, filled with scribbled handwriting that was barely legible. "What does it say?" I asked, leaning closer. Elliot scanned the pages, his brow furrowing as he deciphered the text. "It's a record of what happened here. Rituals, sacrifices, and warnings." My stomach turned at the word sacrifices. Warnings of what? Elliot's gaze darkened as he flipped to the final page, where a single phrase was scrawled in jagged letters: "The Protector watches." The chill that ran down my spine was like nothing I had ever felt before. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't just folklore or myth. It was real, and it was watching. The weight of the journal in Elliot's hand seemed to deepen the chill that already saturated the clearing. The phrase "the Protector watches" was still visible on the final page, its jagged letters etched with purpose, as if the writer had carved the warning into the paper rather than merely penned it. Elliot's face betrayed no emotion as he closed the journal, but I could feel the tension radiating off of him, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the flicker of thought behind his unwavering gaze. He handed the journal to me, his gloved fingers steady as he shifted his attention back to the structure. "Document everything," he said tersely, and without hesitation, I flipped open my notebook to record what I could: the twisted beams, the eerie claw marks, the unsettling remnants of rituals performed long ago. My hand trembled as I wrote, the stillness of the woods pressing against me like a vice. Deputy Harris shifted uneasily behind us, his flashlight beam jerking across the clearing in erratic swipes. He hadn't said much since the sound had ceased, but his discomfort was palpable, and I couldn't blame him. Black Hollow Woods had a way of sinking its claws into you, leaving behind an unmistakable feeling of trespass. Elliot crouched again beside the remnants of the altar, examining the disturbed earth with an intensity that could have melted stone. "Something's missing," he muttered, his voice low but resolute. I stepped closer, careful to avoid the jagged splinters of wood that jutted out from the structure. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the altar's cracked surface. "Rituals like this leave markers, objects meant to hold power or channel it. Whatever was here, it's been taken." Harris frowned, his flashlight beam catching on a patch of overgrown moss. Taken by who? Elliot didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting toward the tree-line. The journal doesn't give us names. But whoever they were, they understood what this place was. I glanced down at the weathered book in my hands, flipping through pages filled with rambling text and crude drawings. The symbols mirrored the markings we'd found earlier, the spirals, the jagged scratches, but there was something else that caught my attention. A passage written in the same frantic scrawl as the warning, the ink smeared in places but still legible. Asterisk, the Protector sleeps beneath the hollow tree. Awake only by blood, only by grief, asterisk. I swallowed hard, the words twisting in my mind. Elliot, there's more here. Something about awakening the Protector. It mentions blood. His expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. Sacrifice, he said simply, the word falling heavy between us. Harris blanched, his face pale as the beam of his flashlight. Sacrifice? You think someone, what? Called this Protector? Woke it up? You can't seriously believe that. I wanted to echo Harris's skepticism, but the air in the clearing told a different story, a story that defied logic or rational explanation. The oppressive chill, the claw marks, the journal's warning, it all pointed to something far darker than simple folklore. Before Elliot could respond, the forest itself seemed to shift around us. A faint breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sound so subtle that I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. It wasn't the wailing from before, nor the snapping of branches. It was deeper, older, like the groan of the earth itself. Elliot straightened, his posture tense as his flashlight swung toward the direction of the sound. We're not alone, he said quietly, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Harris's breathing quickened, his flashlight darting across the clearing in erratic arcs. What do you mean, we're not alone? I don't see anything. That's the point, Elliot replied, his voice calm but firm. Whatever's here doesn't want to be seen. I tightened my grip on the journal, my thoughts racing as I tried to piece together the fragments of information we'd uncovered. The Protector watches. Blood, grief, sacrifice. The hollow tree. It all felt connected, but the connections were blurred, obscured by the oppressive weight of the woods. Elliot stepped forward, his flashlight cutting a clean beam through the fog. Miguel, stay close. Harris, keep your weapon ready. I followed him, my heart pounding as we moved toward the tree-line. Every step felt heavy, deliberate, as though the earth itself was resisting us. The shadows grew thicker, their forms stretching long and jagged across the ground, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of whatever had made the sound. And then, as we reached the edge of the clearing, Elliot froze. His flashlight illuminated the base of a massive tree, a hollow oak that stood like a sentinel at the heart of the forest. Its trunk was scarred with markings that mirrored the ones we'd seen earlier, spirals etched deep into the wood as if carved by an ancient hand. This is it, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped closer, the journal still clutched in my hand. The passage replayed in my mind, its words sharp and unyielding. The Protector sleeps beneath the hollow tree. What are we looking for? Harris asked, his voice trembling. Elliot didn't answer immediately, his flashlight sweeping across the ground. The earth here was disturbed, the soil darker and looser than it should have been, as though something had been buried or unearthed. He crouched, his gloved fingers brushing over the disturbed soil. Miguel, he said, his voice steady. The journal mentioned blood. There's a ritual connected to this tree, it's a focal point. Whatever happened here, it started with this. I knelt beside him, my flashlight illuminating the spirals carved into the tree's hollow trunk. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, their edges sharp and jagged, as if they had been carved recently. "What do you think happened?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Elliot's gaze darkened. "The Protector isn't just folklore. It's real, and it's awake." The words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could respond, the air around us shifted. A low, guttural sound echoed through the woods, deeper than anything we'd heard before. It wasn't human, nor was it animal. It was something else entirely, something primal and ancient. Harris stumbled back, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. What was that?" Elliot didn't answer, his focus unwavering as he rose to his feet, his revolver drawn. "Whatever happens, stay close. And don't run." The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt the earth tremble beneath me. The shadows around the hollow tree seemed to stretch and twist, their forms growing darker, thicker, until they became almost tangible. I gripped the journal tightly, my breathing shallow as I turned toward Elliot. "Do you think it's here?" He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes held the answer. Whatever we had awakened in Black Hollow Woods, it wasn't going to let us leave. The guttural sound reverberated through the woods, low and primal, as though it had emerged from the very roots of the earth. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick with an unnatural tension that clung to my skin like damp fog. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its pale beam struggling against the oppressive shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with a life of their own. Elliot was motionless, a hunter poised in the moment before the strike, his revolver raised and steady. His eyes scanned the forest with a sharpness that belied the quiet storm building within him. "Don't move," he commanded softly, his voice like steel, cutting through the air with an authority that even the woods seemed to acknowledge. Deputy Harris was a stark contrast, trembling so violently that the beam of his flashlight jittered against the hollow tree like a frantic heartbeat. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice a ragged edge of panic. "What's making that sound?" "I don't know yet," Elliot replied, his tone betraying none of the apprehension I was certain he must feel. "But it's close." My own breathing felt too loud, too intrusive in the unnatural stillness that had fallen over the clearing. I took a step closer to Elliot, the journal still clutched tightly in my hand. The phrase "the Protector watches" pulsed in my mind, a grim mantra that refused to be silenced. The sound came again, closer this time, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to ripple through the air, setting the very ground beneath us vibrating. It wasn't the sound of a beast or an animal, it was something altogether different, a sound that defied categorization yet carried an instinctual weight of dread. Elliot shifted his flashlight toward the base of the hollow tree, its scarred trunk illuminated in harsh relief. The carvings seemed to shimmer in the light, their jagged edges casting shadows that danced like spectral figures across the bark. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the loose soil, every movement deliberate. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely audible. "The journal, it said something about blood and grief awakening the Protector. Do you think?" "I think we're about to find out," he interrupted, his eyes never leaving the tree. My pulse quickened as I turned my own flashlight toward the base of the massive oak. The disturbed earth and spiraling carvings seemed to radiate an energy that wasn't entirely of this world, an ancient and unyielding power that resisted comprehension. And then it happened. The air around the tree seemed to shift, bending and warping as though reality itself was struggling to maintain its grip. A low hum rose from the ground, vibrating through my boots and up into my chest, where it reverberated like the echo of a distant storm. Elliot took a step back, his revolver raised and steady. "Miguel," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the rising cacophony. "Stay behind me." The warning came too late. A shadow erupted from the base of the tree, a formless mass that seemed to writhe and twist as it rose, its edges blurred and flickering like the static of a broken signal. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, its beam swallowed by the encroaching darkness. "What in God's name is that?" Harris gasped, stumbling backward as the shadow coalesced, its shape becoming more defined. It stood taller than any man, its form humanoid yet grotesquely elongated, its limbs stretched and twisted in ways that defied anatomy. Eyes, if they could be called that, burned like molten coals within the shifting mass, pinpoints of crimson light that seemed to pierce straight through me. The shadow, it could only be the Protector, moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. It didn't walk so much as it glided, its body shifting and flowing like liquid smoke. The growl that had reverberated through the woods now emanated from the entity itself, a sound that carried with it the weight of centuries, of untold suffering and anger. Elliot didn't hesitate. He fired a shot, the crack of the revolver shattering the heavy silence. The bullet disappeared into the shadow, leaving no trace, no effect. The Protector didn't flinch, didn't falter. Instead, it turned its burning eyes toward Elliot, its form swelling and shifting as though feeding on the very act of defiance. "Run!" Elliot barked, his voice cutting through the paralysis that had gripped me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing as I struggled to process what I was seeing. Harris was already moving, his flashlight discarded in his panic as he sprinted toward the safety of the tree lean. I hesitated, torn between the primal urge to flee and the unwavering trust one had in Elliot. "Miguel, go!" Elliot shouted again, his voice sharp with urgency. Reluctantly, I turned and followed Harris, the journal pressed tightly against my chest as I ran. The forest blurred around me, the shadows closing in like a tidal wave of darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps, each step a battle against the primal fear that threatened to overtake me. Behind me, I heard the sound of another gunshot, followed by a deep, resonant growl that shook the ground beneath my feet. I glanced back just in time to see the Protector surge toward Elliot, its form engulfing him in a wave of darkness that defied the light of his flashlight. "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. But Elliot didn't retreat, didn't falter. He stood his ground, his revolver raised as he faced the entity head-on. The Protector halted its advance, its form flickering and shifting as though uncertain. Elliot lowered his weapon slightly, his gaze locked on the burning eyes that stared back at him. There was a tension in the air, a moment suspended between action and consequence. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Protector withdrew. Its form dissolved into the shadows, its burning eyes fading into the darkness. The growl subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. Elliot turned, his expression unreadable as he strode toward me. His revolver hung loosely at his side, the barrel still warm from the shots he had fired. "We're not done here," he said, his voice steady but tinged with an edge I had rarely heard. I nodded, my grip on the journal tightening. Whatever had just happened, whatever force we had encountered in Black Hollow Woods, it was far from over. The silence in the woods was more profound than I'd ever experienced, a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Elliot stood a few feet ahead, his revolver holstered now but his posture still tense. The shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, twisting in ways that defied the light of our flashlights. Deputy Harris was leaning against a tree nearby, his face pale and streaked with sweat. He hadn't spoken since the encounter with the Protector, and I couldn't blame him. My own thoughts were a maelstrom of disbelief and dread. Whatever force we had awakened in Black Hollow Woods, it was real, alive in a way I could scarcely comprehend. Elliot's voice broke the silence. "Miguel, What else did the journal say? I flipped it open with trembling hands, scanning the pages once more. The ink was smudged and the handwriting erratic, but the sense of urgency in the words was unmistakable. It mentioned blood and grief, I said, my voice shaky. It said the Protector could only be awakened through sacrifice. But there's more. There's a passage about its purpose. Go on, Elliot prompted. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to focus despite the pounding in my chest. The Protector guards the sacred land, striking down those who trespass or defile its sanctity. It is neither cruel nor merciful. It exists to serve the balance. I hesitated before reading the next part, which felt like a dagger in my chest. Beware its judgment, for it does not discern innocence from guilt. All intruders are prey. Harris groaned softly, his voice strained. You mean to tell me that thing doesn't care who we are? It just wants us dead because we're here? I glanced at Elliot, who was staring at the hollow tree with an intensity that bordered on fixation. It wants its land protected, he said finally. And it sees us as a threat. The weight of his words settled heavily over us. I tightened my grip on the journal, the leather binding slick from the dampness of my palms. The Protector wasn't simply a malevolent force, it was a sentinel, an entity bound to a purpose older than anyone could fathom. But why had it awakened now? What had been disturbed to bring it to life? Elliot's flashlight swept across the ground, illuminating the disturbed earth around the base of the tree. Something's missing here, he muttered. Whatever ritual woke the Protector, it required more than just symbols and intent. It needed a catalyst. I knelt beside him, my fingers brushing across the uneven soil. The patterns etched into the earth were similar to those carved into the tree, spirals overlapping in intricate formations. But something about them felt incomplete, as if the ritual had been hurried or interrupted. What kind of catalyst? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Blood, Elliot said simply. Grief. Harris stepped forward, his flashlight beam shaky. You think someone died here? Someone bled for that thing? Elliot nodded, his expression grim. Not just anyone. The journal mentions sacrifice. Whoever performed the ritual knew exactly what they were doing. I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I tried to piece together the fragments of information we'd uncovered. The Wilson family's disappearance, the journal's warnings, the spirals carved into the earth, it all felt connected, but the connections were blurred, obscured by the oppressive weight of the woods. Do you think the Wilsons were part of the ritual? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the hollow tree. We need to find out, he said at last, his tone resolute. But we won't get answers standing here. We need to keep moving. Harris's face twisted in disbelief. You want to keep going? After what we just saw? That thing could kill us, Brooks. Then stay here, Elliot replied coldly. But don't expect it to leave you alone. The deputy paled even further, his flashlight dropping slightly as he glanced nervously at the tree lean. Fine, he muttered. But if I die out here, I'm haunting you, Brooks. Elliot didn't respond. He was already moving, his flashlight cutting through the shadows as he followed the faint trail that led deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, my gaze lingering on the hollow tree before I forced myself to follow him. Harris trailed behind, his movements sluggish and reluctant. The trail wound through the forest like a vein, its path narrow and uneven. The air grew colder with every step, the shadows pressing closer as though the woods were trying to suffocate us. I kept my flashlight steady, but the beam seemed weaker here, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded us. Do you feel that? I asked quietly, breaking the silence. Feel what? Elliot replied without turning. Like the air's heavier. Like the forest doesn't want us here. He didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. I glanced back at Harris, whose flashlight beam flickered faintly as he struggled to keep up. His face was a mask of fear, his breath shallow and uneven. The trail led us to another clearing, smaller than the first but equally unsettling. At its center stood a weathered stone slab, its surface etched with spiraling symbols similar to those we had seen earlier. The grass around it was trampled, the soil disturbed in patterns that mirrored the markings on the slab. Elliot approached the stone, his movements deliberate. Another altar, he said quietly. But this one's different. I joined him, my flashlight illuminating the carvings on the stone. They were deeper here, more intricate, as though etched with precision rather than haste. The patterns seemed to pulse in the dim light, their edges sharp and jagged. What do you think happened here? I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot crouched beside the stone, his gloved fingers brushing across the carvings. This wasn't just a ritual site. It was a focal point. A focal point for what? He hesitated before answering, his gaze darkening. For the Protector. This is where it was bound, and where it was freed. The words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could respond, a sudden noise broke through the stillness, a sharp, snapping sound like branches cracking under pressure. I swung my flashlight toward the source, my heart pounding as I searched for any sign of movement. Elliot, I said, my voice tight. Did you hear that? I heard it, he replied, his own flashlight sweeping across the tree-line. Stay close. The snapping sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a low growl that vibrated through the ground. My pulse quickened as I tightened my grip on the journal, the weight of the forest pressing against me. And then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, the shadows moved. The shadows rippled unnaturally, moving like liquid darkness just beyond the edge of the clearing. My flashlight beam trembled as I turned it toward the movement, but the light seemed to falter, as though the woods themselves were swallowing it whole. The low growl we'd heard earlier rumbled again, resonating like the distant roll of thunder, yet far too close. Elliot took a deliberate step forward, revolver raised and his body rigid with focus. He seemed to be calculating, waiting for the inevitable moment when the silence would break and the thing in the dark would reveal itself. Hold steady, he said, his voice low and commanding. Harris, on the other hand, was already unraveling. He stumbled back a step, his flashlight beam veering wildly as his breathing turned shallow and frantic. This is insane, he muttered, his words tumbling over themselves. We need to leave. We need to get out of here now. If you run, it'll be the last thing you ever do, Elliot snapped, his tone cold enough to slice through Harris's panic. Stay where you are. The growl rose in pitch, filling the clearing with its unnatural resonance. My grip tightened on the journal, its leather binding slick against my palm. I forced myself to breathe evenly, even as my instincts screamed at me to flee. But Elliot's words rang clear in my mind, running wouldn't save me. Whatever stalked us in Black Hollow Woods wasn't bound by the same rules as the living. Elliot, I whispered, keeping my voice low. What's the plan? He didn't answer immediately. His gaze was locked on the shifting darkness, his flashlight tracking the subtle movements as though he could anticipate where the threat would emerge. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, calculated. We're not dealing with an animal or a person. This is something ancient. Something bound to these woods. It doesn't follow our logic. That's not a plan, Harris hissed, his fear tipping toward anger. Elliot didn't dignify him with a response. Instead, he reached into his coat and retrieved something I hadn't seen before, a small pouch, its fabric worn and faded but clearly significant. He opened it carefully, revealing a handful of fine, powdery substance that glittered faintly in the dim light. "What is that?" I asked, my curiosity momentarily eclipsing my fear. "Salt," Elliot replied simply. "Mixed with iron filings. It won't kill whatever's out there, but it might slow it down." Harris looked as though he might be sick. "You came prepared for this? You knew what we were walking into?" "I knew it was a possibility," Elliot said, his attention never wavering from the tree lean. "Now hold your ground." The growl swelled again, and this time, the shadows surged forward. They didn't move like a living thing, they flowed, seeping across the ground with an unnatural fluidity. My flashlight flickered as the darkness crept closer, my breath catching in my throat. Elliot acted swiftly, throwing a handful of the salt and iron mixture in an arc around us. The effect was immediate, a sharp, crackling sound like ice fracturing under pressure, and the shadows recoiled as though struck. The growl shifted, rising into an almost human-like wail that sent shivers racing down my spine. "It doesn't like that," Elliot muttered. "Good." The reprieve was short-lived. The shadows gathered themselves, coiling and twisting as they retreated to the edge of the clearing. For a moment, there was silence, a stillness so profound that even the forest seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the darkness erupted. It came from all sides, surging toward us like a tidal wave of blackened mist. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to make sense of the chaos. The air seemed to grow thicker, pressing against my chest as the temperature plummeted. Elliot was a flurry of motion, his revolver cracking sharply as he fired into the encroaching shadows. The bullets didn't stop them, but they slowed their advance, the sound of the gunshots echoing through the woods like a desperate battle cry. Harris was screaming now, his flashlight discarded as he fumbled for his sidearm. He fired blindly into the darkness, his movements erratic and panicked. The shadows seemed to swell around him, drawn to his fear like sharks to blood. "Get to the altar!" Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. "It's the focal point, our best chance." I didn't hesitate. Clutching the journal tightly, I sprinted toward the weathered stone slab at the center of the clearing. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to pulse in the dim light, their edges glowing faintly as though reacting to the presence of the Protector. Harris stumbled after me, his movements clumsy and desperate. Elliot was the last to move, his steps deliberate as he threw another handful of salt behind him, the crackling sound buying us precious seconds. We reached the altar just as the shadows surged again, their formless mass coiling around the edges of the clearing. Elliot positioned himself between us and the encroaching darkness, his revolver raised and his jaw set in determination. "Open the journal," he said without looking back. "Find anything, that might give us an edge." I obeyed, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. The text blurred before my eyes, but I forced myself to focus, scanning for anything that might offer a clue. Finally, my gaze landed on a passage near the end, a section written in the same frantic scrawl as the earlier warning. Asterisk, the Protector's wrath is bound to its purpose. Disrupt the balance, and it will falter. Blood must be answered with blood. Grief must be answered with grief, asterisk. I read the words aloud, my voice shaky but audible. Elliot's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. "It's tied to the ritual," he said. "It needs completion or disruption." "What does that mean?" Harris shouted, his voice tinged with hysteria. "How do we disrupt it?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to the altar, then to the hollow tree at the edge of the clearing. The spiraling carvings glowed faintly now, their light pulsing in rhythm with the growls emanating from the shadows. "We finish what they started," Elliot said at last, his tone grim. "Or we undo it completely." The weight of his words settled over us like a shroud. The shadows coiled tighter around the clearing, their movements growing more aggressive. Time was running out. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, forcing myself to steady my voice. Elliot handed me the pouch of salt and iron. "Draw a boundary around the altar. Keep it contained." I nodded, taking the pouch and working quickly. The substance spilled from my hands in a fine line, forming a circle around the weathered stone. The shadows recoiled as I worked, their growls rising in pitch as though sensing what we were attempting. Elliot turned to Harris. "You have a choice," he said. "Stay here and help us, or run and face whatever's waiting out there." Harris swallowed hard, his face pale and slick with sweat. For a moment, I thought he might bolt, but then he nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped his weapon tighter. "What do you need?" "Cover me," Elliot said simply. "I'll handle the rest." With that, he stepped toward the hollow tree, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he approached its scarred trunk. The growls grew louder, the shadows surging in response, but Elliot didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat and pulled out the rusted blade we'd found earlier, its jagged edge glinting faintly in the dim light. Whatever Elliot planned to do, it was clear that the Protector wouldn't let him do it easily. The shadows struck with renewed fury, their formless mass crashing against the boundary I had drawn. The salt and iron line crackled and hissed, holding them back, for now. "Elliot, hurry!" I shouted, my voice strained with urgency. He didn't look back. His focus was absolute as he pressed the blade against the hollow tree, the carvings glowing brighter in response. The growls turned into an ear-piercing wail, the shadows writhing violently as the balance of power shifted. And then, with a single, deliberate motion, Elliot drove the blade into the heart of the spiral. The moment Elliot drove the jagged blade into the heart of the spiral, the world seemed to fracture. The ground beneath us shuddered violently, a deep, resonant tremor that felt as though the earth itself was groaning in protest. The glow from the carvings on the hollow tree erupted into an intense light, piercing the dense fog and illuminating the clearing in stark, surreal detail. The shadows that had surged around us recoiled, twisting and writhing as though in agony. Their forms began to fragment, breaking apart like shards of obsidian glass scattering into the air. The low growl that had been their constant presence turned into an otherworldly wail, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the marrow of my bones. It was the cry of something ancient, something torn from its purpose. Elliot staggered back, the blade still lodged in the tree as the spirals carved into its surface pulsed erratically. His face was a mask of grim determination, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the toll this encounter was taking on him. "It's working," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "The balance is shifting." I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The light emanating from the tree was growing brighter, its intensity almost blinding, while the wailing of the shadows reached a fever pitch. I glanced at Harris, who was crouched near the altar, his face pale and slick with sweat. He had stopped firing his weapon, his hands trembling as he clung to its grip like it was the only tether to his sanity. "What do we do now?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the chaotic symphony of sound and light. Elliot turned to me, his expression grave. "We end it," he said simply, as if the weight of those words didn't carry the potential for catastrophe. "The Protector can't maintain its form in this state. It's caught between its purpose and the disruption we've caused." but the ritual isn't complete yet. And if we don't complete it? I asked, dread curling in my chest. Then the protector will tear itself apart, Elliot replied. And it'll take everything around it with it. That was all I needed to hear. I scrambled toward the altar, the journal clutched tightly in my hands as I flipped through its weathered pages. The text blurred before my eyes, the words swimming on the page as panic threatened to overwhelm me. But then I found it, the final passage, scrawled in desperate, uneven handwriting. Asterisk, the protector's release demands recompense. Blood for blood. Grief for grief. Only when the circle is closed shall the balance be restored, asterisk. Elliot! I shouted, holding up the journal. It says the circle has to be closed. Blood for blood, grief for grief. What does that mean? His gaze shifted back to the tree, the light from the spirals casting sharp shadows across his face. It means someone has to pay the price, he said quietly. The weight of his words hit me like a blow. A sacrifice, I murmured, the realization settling in my chest like a stone. It's the only way to complete the ritual. Harris let out a strangled laugh, the sound tinged with hysteria. Oh, great. Fantastic. And who exactly is supposed to make that sacrifice? Because it sure as hell isn't going to be me. Elliot's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He was already moving, his steps deliberate as he approached the base of the hollow tree. The glow from the carvings was almost unbearable now, the light pulsating in erratic waves that seemed to distort the very fabric of the air around it. Elliot, wait! I called after him, panic rising in my throat. There has to be another way. We don't even know if this will work. He paused, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. If we don't try, it won't matter. The protector will destroy everything and everyone. This land, this town, it'll all be consumed. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced for alternatives, for solutions that didn't involve sacrificing someone to appease an ancient force of vengeance. But the journal's words were clear. The circle had to be closed. And Elliot had already made up his mind. Before I could say anything more, the ground beneath us shifted again, the tremors growing more violent. The spirals carved into the tree began to fracture, their lines splitting and cracking as the light within them flared brighter than ever. The protector's fragmented form surged forward, its twisted mass reaching for the altar as though desperate to stop us. Harris screamed, his flashlight dropping to the ground as he scrambled back toward the edge of the clearing. I could feel the heat of the light from the spirals, the oppressive weight of the protector's presence pressing down on me like a vice. Time was running out. Elliot turned back to me, his eyes meeting mine for what felt like an eternity. There was no fear in his expression, only resolve. Miguel, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. You have to trust me. I didn't know if I could. But I nodded anyway, my throat tight as I watched him take the blade from the tree, its jagged edge glinting in the unnatural light. He stepped toward the altar, his movements deliberate, his intent clear. The protector's wail rose to a deafening crescendo, its fragmented form twisting and writhing as though trying to stop him. But Elliot didn't falter. He placed the blade against his palm, the sharp edge biting into his skin, and let the blood flow onto the altar's surface. The effect was instantaneous. The spirals on the altar flared with a blinding light, their patterns shifting and reforming as though knitting themselves back together. The protector recoiled, its form shattering further as it emitted a sound that could only be described as anguish. I shielded my eyes against the light, the heat and intensity of it almost unbearable. The ground beneath us heaved one final time, and then silence. When I dared to look again, the clearing was still. The spirals on the altar had faded, their glow extinguished, and the hollow tree stood silent and unmoving. The protector was gone, its presence erased as though it had never been. Elliot was slumped against the altar, his breathing shallow but steady. Blood dripped from the cut on his hand, pooling on the weathered stone in dark, glistening droplets. He looked up at me, his face pale but his eyes sharp. "It's done," he said simply. But as I moved to help him, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, that Black Hollow Woods had not yet released us from its grasp. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that pressed against your ears until you could feel the absence of sound like a physical weight. The clearing seemed frozen in time, the glow of the spirals gone, the eerie light extinguished. The hollow tree stood motionless, its scarred bark dull and lifeless now, as if the very essence of Black Hollow Woods had retreated into the shadows. I knelt beside Elliot, whose pale face was slick with sweat, his breathing steady but shallow. His blood still pooled on the altar, dark against the weathered stone, a grim testament to the cost of what we had done. The journal lay open in my lap, its final words seared into my mind: "The circle is closed." Harris was slumped against the trunk of a nearby tree, his eyes darting nervously between us and the tree-line as though expecting the protector to surge forward again. But the woods were quiet, eerily so. Even the oppressive fog seemed to have lifted, revealing the faint outlines of the clearing and the twisting paths beyond. "We need to leave," Harris croaked, his voice shaky but firm. "This place, it's not safe. We need to get out now, while we still can." Elliot stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he pushed himself upright with a grunt of effort. "It's over," he said, his voice low but steady. "The protector's purpose has been fulfilled. It's gone." I wanted to believe him, but the unease that clung to my chest refused to let go. Black Hollow Woods didn't feel empty, it felt watching, waiting. Still, I nodded, rising to my feet and helping Elliot steady himself. "We need to make sure the Wilsons didn't suffer the same fate," I said, gesturing toward the journal. "There are still questions we haven't answered. The curse may be lifted, but the secrets of this place, of this town, they're far from gone." Elliot fixed me with a piercing gaze, his blue eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that lined his face. "The answers won't come from this clearing," he said simply. "They'll come from the people who wanted this ritual performed in the first place. The reminder of the town's elites, the mayor and the others whose greed had likely fed into the Protector's awakening, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a battle against folklore or the supernatural. It was a battle against humanity's darkest impulses, against the arrogance of those who believed they could exploit forces beyond their comprehension without consequence. We began a slow walk back to the car, the woods eerily silent as we retraced our steps. The trail felt different now, less oppressive but still heavy with the echoes of what had transpired. I glanced back once, my eyes lingering on the hollow tree as it disappeared into the mist. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow shift against its trunk, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the time we reached the car, the sun was breaking through the clouds, its pale light filtering through the trees like a fragile promise of normalcy. Harris slid into the passenger seat without a word, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the dashboard. Elliot climbed into the driver's seat, his movements slow and deliberate, while I took my place in the back, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The drive back to town was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. I stared out the window, watching the forest blur into the distance as the car climbed the narrow dirt road. The events of the past hours replayed in my mind, each moment sharper and more vivid than the last. The Protector, the spirals, Elliot's sacrifice, all of it had burned itself into my memory, leaving behind an imprint that I knew would never fade. When we arrived in Willowshade, the town seemed unchanged, quaint and quiet, its streets lined with charming storefronts and neatly painted houses. But I knew better. Beneath the surface, the town was steeped in secrets, its history intertwined with the curse of Black Hollow Woods in ways that most of its residents would never understand. Elliot didn't park outside the sheriff's station or the mayor's office. Instead, he drove to the edge of the town square, where a group of locals had gathered near the fountain, their faces marked by concern and unease. Among them was the ranger who had first reported the Wilsons' abandoned car, his expression tight with worry as he spoke to a woman I assumed was Mrs. Wilson's sister. "Stay here," Elliot said, his voice firm as he stepped out of the car. "This is something I need to do alone." I watched as he approached the group, his tall figure cutting through the crowd with the ease of someone who commanded authority wherever he went. He spoke to the ranger briefly, his voice low and measured, before turning to the woman. Her eyes widened as he handed her a piece of torn fabric, the jacket we had found near the altar. Her expression was a mixture of relief and anguish, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric to her chest. Elliot returned to the car, his face unreadable but his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had just done. "The Wilsons," he began, then paused. "They're gone." The confirmation hit me like a blow. Harris swore under his breath, his face pale as he stared out at the town square. I could feel the weight of grief pressing down on us, the collective realization that the curse of Black Hollow Woods had claimed more victims than we could save. But as we drove away, the sunlight breaking through the clouds and painting the town in golden hues, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The woods may have taken their toll, but the balance had been restored, and the Protector was gone. It wouldn't strike again, not here, not now. Elliot glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his piercing gaze meeting mine. "This isn't over," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "The woods are silent, but the truth of what happened here, it'll surface. And we'll be ready." I nodded, clutching the journal tightly as the car sped away from Willowshade, leaving the secrets of Black Hollow Woods behind us, for now. The sunlight bathed the horizon in warm hues, casting a hopeful glow over the road ahead. But in the back of my mind, I knew that the legacy of the Protector would linger, haunting the edges of memory and history alike. For now, though, the woods were silent. And silence, I realized, could be both a blessing and a curse.